Hi folks, quick video today looking at the management of extreme weather. Now I've already had a look in other videos and in class at causes of extreme weather. We've looked at anticyclones and depressions and the types of weather systems that they can create which can form extremes. We've looked at the impacts of some extreme weather types. We've looked at the social, economic, environmental and political impacts that come from extreme weather. And we've sort of looked a little bit at responses, how people have responded to the threat of these extreme types of weather. Today we're going to look a bit more carefully at those responses, or if you like, the management of extreme weather. When we talk about management, we're thinking about how can we take what we've been given, the form of extreme weather and the risks that are provided, how can we modify that, if you like, into something that can be more manageable, something that's not going to make us as vulnerable, not going to put us at as much risk. So there's three management strategies which we can think of as modifications. Now these modifications are both long and short term in different amounts. So we're going to look at all three strategies and decide which ones are best for which purposes. First off, we have modifying the event. Now what this means is reducing the impact of the event of the extreme weather, coming up with ways of actually reducing the impact. The classic example is the flood wall. Flood defences, coastal defences, these are classic modification of events, making an extreme event less likely to damage a vulnerable population. These can be hard engineering, such as walls, coastal defences, drains, or they can be softer engineering, such as ditches, allowing certain areas of land to flood, having no build zones. These are all modification of the event. Now there are positives and negatives to modifying the event. Positives are that long term it's a good idea because it protects a large number of people. It means that you know what the events are likely to be and you try to modify the event that's coming. The downside is hard engineering in particular tends to be very expensive, so does soft engineering. Also, you don't actually know whether those defences are going to stand up to the extreme weather events that we're getting, considering they are getting larger and they are getting less predictable based on global warming. Also, it's not possible to hard engineer against everything. Sure, you can hard engineer against droughts, with water facilities, and with storms, with shelters, and with floods, with walls and such, but other forms of extreme weather, particularly things like heat waves, there's very little you can actually do about them. So long-term benefits can be quite large, but they are expensive, hence they tend to be seen in the more developed countries. You can also modify the vulnerability. Now modifying the vulnerability takes the approach of, well, how about we reduce the vulnerability of the people? What about informing them using technology, mapping out areas where there are risks of extreme weather, and also mapping the extreme weather as it occurs, using things like satellites and agencies such as the NOAA, which we have discussed before. Modification of vulnerability has a lot of benefits. As seen in Cuba, the number of deaths from hurricanes has been reduced right down, even though they've not got many flood defences from the storm surges or storm defences, by educating people, by mapping out and following hurricanes as they move across the Atlantic, using the USA's technology and using their own weather stations, they can actually reduce the vulnerability, reduce the chance of deaths. Now, it's all very well and good reducing the number of deaths, reducing the vulnerability, but it won't protect property in the same way. It's not foolproof, and it does rely on our technology. So again, it tends to be the more developed countries or countries that have access to the same resources as the more developed countries. It tends to work well in conjunction with modifying the event. You can protect people's property with things like walls and drainage systems such as the SUDS system seen in the UK after the 2007 floods. The big benefit as well of modifying the vulnerability is that you can modify people's vulnerability as the hazard unfolds. It's not just like these defences in advance of the next disaster, generally coming from a disaster or hazard at the very least occurring in the first place. So that's all very well and good. Protect people and property and warn them in advance. We can also, though, modify the loss. We can actually provide aid and provide money to people and goods and services while people are really suffering. This tends to be very, very short term. The FEMA responded to Hurricane Katrina, admittedly very late, but they responded and provided aid, money, clothing, food, that sort of thing. That is modifying the loss. You're making sure people don't lose as much. Insurance companies are part of that as well. If your property is insured, you haven't lost as much. So financial aid and provision tends to be there. Modifying the loss, though, does tend to rely on some element of modifying vulnerability. Knowing what's happening in the storms, for example, or the floods, so that aid can be distributed appropriately. So those are the three main ways of managing extreme weather. There are many more details, many more positives and negatives, many more things that can be fed in to this basic framework. But hopefully this gives you some idea of the three modifications. Modifying the event, so reducing the impact of the physical event through engineering. Modifying vulnerability, educating and preparing people for an extreme weather event so that they are not as much at risk when it occurs. And modifying the loss, giving people aid and support to get through the worst times of the event. If you have any questions, let me know. We'll be covering this in more detail in class. Thanks for watching. See you next time.